Today's lesson is going to be on the defence of loss of control. So this is the longer lesson, and then I'll do a separate video on the AO1, which is the factual content that you need for an essay and that you need for a scenario. And then I will do a third video, which is the AO3, which is your evaluation. So just a few kind of points to introduce the defence. First of all, it's what we call a special defence. This means it's just available to murder. So loss of control, like diminished responsibility, is not available to any other crime. It's just murder. It's also what we call a partial defence. So it reduces murder to manslaughter, and this is voluntary manslaughter. Now, the good thing about this is that the judge does not have to give a life sentence. So if you remember, with murder, it's mandatory life. With manslaughter, it's discretionary life. So you could get 5 years in prison, you could get life in prison. Equally, you might not get any time in prison. You might get a suspended sentence. The burden of proof, it follows the normal criminal law rules that the defendant does not have to prove anything. So the burden of proof is upon the prosecution to disprove loss of control beyond all reasonable doubt. So what happens is the defendant says, I'm not guilty of that crime because I lost control. And it's like, right, over to the prosecution to prove the defendant had control, that he or she had not lost control. It replaces the old law of provocation. So you might hear on television or in some textbooks, they'll talk about provocation. So that's what loss of control used to be called. And provocation came from the Homicide Act 1957. It was amended and replaced by loss of control. 2009, Section 54 of the Coroners and Justice Act. So you are charged with murder. If you remember, our definition for murder is the unlawful killing of a human being under the Queen's peace with malice aforethought. So you're charged with murder and you are claiming the defence because you want it to be manslaughter. So you're not really disputing that the person's been killed. It's almost like you're disputing the reason why they've been killed. You're saying, yes, I did kill them, but there was an excuse for it. Please let me have the defence. Now, loss of control is good because, like diminished responsibility, it's clearly set out into 3 elements. And I just love the structure because then I just think you go away and you learn the 3 elements with the definitions and explanation and the cases. So element 1, we'll start off with that, is there must have been a loss of control. So the old law said that this had to be sudden and temporary, whereas now the Act just says it's just got to be a loss of control. Leave it to the jury to decide. It can't just be a partial loss of control though, so you really have to kind of like lose your temper and snap and not really know what you're doing. So in that moment, you've got to like see red and your behaviour is completely out of character. The case I would use for there must be a loss of control is the case of Duel with a J. The defendant shot the victim and fled the scene and told the jury that when he got out of the car, he lost control and couldn't think straight. Well, the courts decided that that's not loss of control. So there was insufficient evidence that he'd lost control. So you really have to show that you have lost control. And that's all I would say for element 1. So that's dead straightforward, which is good. Element 2, there must be what we call a qualifying trigger. So something has to make you lose control. You don't just suddenly lose your temper over nothing. So there has to be a qualifying trigger. So that can be split into 2 kind of subsections. So a qualifying trigger, so the defendant fears serious violence or the things said or done were of grave character and cause the defendant to have a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. So there are a lot of words in that. So just think, it's got to be a qualifying trigger, and then this part of it, there has to be a fear of serious violence. Now, that fear of serious violence could be to yourself, but it could also be to someone else. So you've just got to be able to identify who that person is. So the case of Ward, the defendant and his brother and the victim were drinking, taking drugs, and then somehow they got into a big argument. The victim, so that's the person who died in the end, the victim hit the defendant's brother. Defendant loses his temper, picks up a pickaxe and kills the victim. So the issue is, did the defendant fear serious violence? Yes, but the defendant feared serious violence towards his brother, but that's okay. So they said this is loss of control. So the defendant did fear serious violence. It was a close enough connection. It was to his brother who was right there. We can identify that person. So qualifying trigger where you either fear serious violence or the things said or done are of a grave character, so serious, bad, and they cause you to have a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. Okay, the other thing just to bear in mind is that if you started the violence or it's revenge, you can't have the defence. Now, the case of Dawes, under this point about being grave character, seriously wronged, Dawes found his wife and the victim lying together, entwined, all over each other on the sofa. And he stabbed the victim and killed him. Now, sexual infidelity is not a qualifying trigger. That's not enough. So if you find out your partner's having an affair and you lose your temper and you kill them, you cannot have loss of control. So they basically said in the case of Dawes, the defendant had a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint. The circumstances were not extremely grave. So it doesn't fall under qualifying trigger. Therefore, it's not loss of control. The other thing about things said or done must be of extremely grave character and causing you to have a justifiable sense of being wronged. This has caused a bit of trouble with the law. Case of Zebedee. So Zebedee looked after his 94-year-old father who kept soiling himself, and he lost his temper and he killed him. And they basically said, no, there's no loss of control here. So yes, your father was incontinent and kept soiling himself and you lost your temper and killed him. But the things said or done, like soiling yourself, is not of extremely grave character. And also, it's not a personal attack on you. So there's no justifiable sense of being seriously wrong. So Zebedee was not allowed the defence. Now, just going back to sexual infidelity. So the 2009 Act said having an affair is not a qualifying trigger. In the case of Clinton, the defendant was depressed, he was on medication, he found out his wife had an affair, and she teased him about this, and she also taunted him about a suicide attempt and saying he couldn't even kill himself. So the following day he killed her, and this was murder. However, the Court of Appeal quashed the murder conviction and substituted it for manslaughter because they said loss of control should have been put to the jury. So the idea is basically if someone's having an affair, that's not a qualifying trigger. But if they taunt you about it and if there are perhaps other things there as well, then potentially that could be a qualifying trigger. But if it's a revenge thing, then that's not loss of control because you've had time to calmly plan your actions, so you shouldn't receive the defence. Then the third element, so it's quite a kind of contained topic, which is nice. Element 3 is a person of the defendant's age and sex with a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint, and in the circumstances might have reacted in the same or a similar way. So you've basically got to think, right, would I, if I was the defendant's age and gender, and I was of normal tolerance, would I have done the same thing? So that's what the jury have to sit there and think, right, would I have done that? Basically, if you have a bad temper, that's not in the circumstances, so ignore bad temper. When you're looking at the level of self-control, you have to look at age and sex. So are they saying that younger people have less self-control? Are they saying that men have less self-control than women? So that's an issue. And when you're looking at the circumstances the defendant's in, you have to try and put yourself in their position. So if they're, I don't know, they're depressed or they've suffered years of abuse, then you need to think, right, would a person who had suffered years of abuse, who was teased about it, would they have killed someone, in that situation? So you have to try and put yourself in the defendant's situation, which is quite difficult, and you would have to look at all the evidence. So that is the content of loss of control. It's quite a wordy defence, so even though it's split into 3 parts, I always feel there's a lot to say about each part, but just go back to it's section 54 of the Coroners and Justice Act. D must have lost control. There has to be a qualifying trigger, and would a person of the same age and sex reacted in a similar way in those circumstances? Okay, so I'll go and do the AO1 and the AO3 videos for you, but hopefully that just gives you a bit of explanation and a bit of detail.